We finished off talking about monopolistically competitive firms. I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about pricing and pricing strategies that are used. So recognize that what we've been talking about shows how firms with market power can take into account how their rivals are going to respond to their own pricing decisions, and how the collective action of both your own firm and your rival firms will shape the demand curve that you face when you're setting prices. One of the things that I want to emphasize here is that non-competitive firms will often use non-uniform pricing. And the idea here is that they won't charge the same price to every consumer. In fact, charging consumers different prices for the same products happens all the time. We often see charging a single consumer a price that depends on the number of units that they buy, and sometimes we see charging a different price based on characteristics of the individual, such as where they live. The idea behind this non-uniform pricing strategy is that it converts consumer surplus into profits. And so the firm can identify a price at which they can extract more surplus from the consumer, that is, they can identify the consumer's willingness to pay, and that serves to benefit the firm. Now, how and why firms price discriminate is important. What's important to recognize is that price discriminating firms avoid the trade-off between a high price and a low price. In particular, they avoid that trade-off of a high price that allows them to extract consumer surplus but gives them a low level of sales, and a low price which gives them a high level of sales but doesn't allow them to extract a lot of consumer surplus. Price discrimination requires three different conditions to be met. First, the firm has to have market power. They can't be a price-taking firm. They have to be able to charge different prices. Consumers also have to differ in terms of their sensitivity to price. That is, individual consumers or groups of consumers have to have different demand elasticities. And the firm has to be able to identify how consumer price differences or price sensitivity varies across individuals. Lastly, the firm has to be able to prevent or limit what are called resales. So the idea here is that if you're a price discriminating firm, you want to prevent someone from selling the product you just sold to them but at a lower price. This may not necessarily make a lot of sense, but there are some conditions or instances where this has happened, and so you need to be able to prevent that resale, because really what it does is it prevents you from facing more competition. Now, there's a number of types of price discrimination that we want to talk about. The first one is called perfect price discrimination. Here, firms sell each unit at the maximum amount any consumer is willing to pay for it. And so what's going on is that those prices are going to differ across all consumers, and the firm, because they can charge a different price to every consumer, can extract all consumer surplus from consumer benefits. And so we see examples of this when it comes to things like car sales and house sales, where there's a negotiation between the buyer and the seller, and if there's any kind of market power by, on the part of one person who's negotiating, then you can actually see extraction of all of the consumer surplus for the benefit of the seller. Another type of price discrimination we see is based on how much people buy, and this is called quantity discrimination. And so firms will charge different prices for larger quantities than for smaller quantities. This isn't a volume discount. That's important to recognize. We're not talking about a volume discount here. What we're saying is that a firm is charging different prices based on larger quantities than for smaller quantities, and all customers who buy a given quantity pay the same price. Okay, and it's not a volume discount, or volume discounts are not price discrimination if, and this is important, if the firm is passing on actual cost savings to the buyer. We often see this kind of quantity discrimination when it comes to things like utilities, where they use block pricing schedules where they charge one price for the first few units of usage and then a different price for subsequent blocks. More recently, we're starting to see this with time of day use, where when there's high periods of use, we see a higher price compared to other periods of day where there's low periods of use in the provision of electricity to homes. We also see something called multi-market price discrimination. And the idea here is that firms will charge different groups of customers different prices. So a given customer is charged the same price per unit, but across customers there might be different groups of customers who get a different price. And you tend to see these different prices only for a few groups of customers, so it's not individually tailored prices, it's for certain customers with particular characteristics. In particular, you have to be able to identify customers on the basis of observable characteristics such as age or region. Another way you can identify customers is also based on the actions of the customers. So for instance, you might see a higher price charged to those who use a phone in order versus those who go into your actual store and pick up the product. Another type of price discrimination we see are called two-part tariffs, and we see these quite a bit in different circumstances. And the idea here is that a customer pays one fee for the right to buy the good, and that's called the first tariff, and another price for each unit purchased, that's called the second tariff. We see this sometimes with health club memberships where there's sometimes an upfront fee and then there's a per visit fee that's associated with it, or particular fees if you want to take classes once you belong to that health club membership. Telephone service is also a good example of this. There's a monthly connection fee and a price per minute of use fee that's charged to users. Car rentals are another example. There's an upfront first tariff that gives you the right to rent the car, but then you're often charged on a per kilometer basis. Cover charges at bars are also an example of this. You have to pay sometimes to get into bars, and then you've got to pay for each drink that you're going to have in that bar. And so you could think of that cover charge and the price that you pay for each unit you consume as a two-part tariff. Tie-in sales are another form of price discrimination, and the idea here is that the consumer may buy one good only if he or she also agrees to buy another good or service. So this is getting at trying to couple different services or goods together in one sale. So think about a vacation package for a minute. These vacation packages often include an airfare and accommodation for a single price, and you're not able to buy one or the other. You have to buy both. They're tied together. Now there's actually two types of tie-in sales. One is called a requirement tie-in sale, where a customer who buys one product from a firm must make all purchases of another product from that firm. So durable machines such as photocopiers are sold this way. The photocopier in our department, for instance, has a service requirement where we have to have Toshiba come and actually provide services to it. So we're not able to have someone else come in and provide servicing for it. It has to be Toshiba, and that's because we bought the photocopier from them with a tie-in sale. Bundling is another example of tie-in sales where two goods are combined so that customers cannot buy either good separately. So the vacation package where you had an airfare and accommodation together is an example of a bundled good. So that's all I want to talk about pricing strategies. There's a couple of other issues that are important when it comes to things like market structure. And one of them is called the vertical boundaries of the firm. And what you have to think about is the process by which you go from having raw inputs for a good to the actual output of the good. And you can think about that as a vertical chain where you have input suppliers, then a producer, then a primary processor, a further processor, a distributor or a wholesaler, and then a retailer. That vertical chain begins with the acquisition of raw materials and ends with distribution and sales. And one of the things economists and people in the business sector often think about are what are called the vertical boundaries of the firm. And these vertical boundaries just define the activities that the firm performs itself as opposed to those activities where they're purchasing from an independent firm in the marketplace. And really what we're getting at are make or buy decisions. Is the firm deciding to make something itself, or are they actually going to go out to a market and buy something from another vendor under the idea that it's actually going to be cheaper to buy from someone than to make it yourself? And so what we're really getting at is whether or not this set of activities in the vertical chain is undertaken by separate economic firms or whether it's undertaken by one economic entity. We used to see a lot of firms acting as what we call vertically integrated firms. This was certainly true in the early 1900s. Today there's still some firms that act as vertically integrated firms, but others are mostly vertically disintegrated. So for instance, Nike is an example of this, and so are a lot of automobile manufacturers, and so are a lot of food processing companies. Now, when it comes to the decision about whether a firm ought to make an input or buy an input in their production process, there's a number of fallacies that I think we need to identify and talk about. One make or buy fallacy is that firms should generally buy rather than make to avoid the cost of making the product. Well, that may be true and it may not be true. It's going to depend on the circumstances. So consider the distribution of finished goods from a manufacturer to a retailer. That manufacturer could do that itself. It could deliver those goods itself, or it could hire someone to do that delivery for them. Either way, the expense of delivery isn't avoided. You can't get out of that. But the efficiency with which that activity, the efficiency with which delivery is undertaken, could vary. It might actually be cheaper to go with an outside independent distributor because they have a better logistics system than you could ever manage on your own. Another make or buy fallacy is that firms should generally make rather than buy to avoid paying a profit margin to independent firms. And the idea here is that firms should integrate to capture the profit of the suppliers from whom they buy. And this is, again, a situation where it can vary one way or the other. For one firm, this might make sense, but for another firm, it may not make sense. You can never eliminate the activity and the costs associated with those activities. In integration, what you might be trying to do is to capture some of the profits associated with what someone who's either supplying you with an input or who you're hiring to help in the delivery of something to capture those profits. So what you have to recognize is that that profit represents the return necessary to attract investment and would be required of the firm that undertakes those activities. It may be cheaper for the firm to pay that high price demanded by a supplier than to actually undertake that activity on your own. The last fallacy is that firms should make rather than buy because a vertically integrated producer will be able to avoid paying high market prices for that input during periods of peak demand or scarce supply. Well, again, this could or it could not be true. Assuming it's cheaper to produce an input at cost rather than buying the input at market prices ignores the potential for hidden opportunity cost to the vertically integrated firm. By using the input to produce its final output, it forgoes outside sales in the open market. And so it's not necessarily the case that arguing that, well, we want to make sure that we avoid those high prices during peak periods of demand or scarce supply. Well, that may not make sense once you start thinking about the opportunity cost of undertaking those activities. Now, we can also think about reasons to either buy an activity or a service or a good from someone else rather than make it yourself, and reasons to make something. When it comes to reasons to buy, there's a couple things that are important. What we would call a market firm, that is a firm that is producing something that you're going to buy, those market firms can achieve significant economies of size. In fact, more so than you as an in-house department might be able to achieve. That's producing only for your own needs. So the idea would be that rather than producing an input on your own, you go out and buy that input from some vendor. And the reason why you would go out and buy that input from some other vendor is that if they've specialized in the production of that input that they're selling to many different buyers, then they're presumably going to have a larger scale of operation and lower costs, benefiting from economies of size, and you can actually buy at a lower price. Another reason you might want to buy is that those market-based firms have to be efficient and innovative to survive, whereas overall business success might hide the inefficiencies associated with making it yourself. And so what's going on here is that those market-based firms, the firms that you're going out and buying an input from, in order to stay successful, have to be efficient and innovative. Whereas if you actually undertake those activities through a make decision within your firm, the inefficiencies associated with your production of that particular input might be masked by your overall business success and your lack of innovation, and that also masks your lack of innovation of that in-house department. Now, with respect to reasons to make, it's important to recognize that this is also very context dependent. And some of the reasons why we think about making an input ourselves or bearing the cost of using producing those inputs ourselves relate to the coordination of production flows through a vertical chain. In particular, coordination of those flows of product might be compromised when an activity is purchased from an independent market firm rather than performed in-house. And so this is sometimes called a hold-up problem, and the idea is that someone from whom you're buying an input that's necessary for your good to be produced or your service to be produced doesn't provide it to you on time, or for whatever reason is unwilling to provide the level of input that you need. And so when that happens, you can't actually undertake production. And so it might make more sense to make that input yourself rather than to rely on someone else making it for you. Another reason to make is that there might be private information that's important. In particular, private information may be leaked to people outside your firm when an activity is performed by an independent market firm. So by going out and buying an input by someone who isn't within your firm, you reveal information about the specifications of that input that you want that could be proprietary information specific to your economic circumstances, and that then is leaked out to maybe your competitors, and that puts you at a competitive disadvantage. Again, motivating the reason to make in-house, because you're then not going to lose that information. Another reason is that there may be costs of transacting with those independent market firms that can be avoided. And so really what we're getting at here are what are the transactions costs associated with going out to buy something. Recall that you're going to have to search out someone with whom to transact. You're going to have to negotiate some terms with them regarding price and details of a contract and any details about the good itself. You then have to monitor the situation to make sure that the firm that you're buying from provides you the goods that they say they're going to buy, and if they don't, you then have to face some enforcement costs. All of that can be avoided if you make in-house, but you have to recognize that it's trading off the cost of those transactions versus the cost of production and the opportunity cost associated with making that product in-house on your own. That's all for imperfect competition for now. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these issues in class.